in the leadership election. President Trump reportedly eyeing a broader administration shakeup following last week's firing of Attorney General Jeff Sessions and retiring Republican Senator Jeff Flake vowing to oppose the president's judicial nominees until legislation to protect special counsel Robert Mueller is brought to a vote on the Senate floor, something Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has so far refused to do.
We know how the president feels about the Mueller investigation, but he's never said he wants to shut it down. I've never heard anybody down there say they want to shut it down. I think it's in no danger, and so I don't think any legislation is necessary.
Let's bring in Wall Street Journal columnist and deputy editor Dan Henninger, columnist Kim Strassel, and editorial page writer Kate Batchelder Odell. So, Kim, let's start with suddenly powerful Democrats in the House of Representatives. Nancy Pelosi, is she really seriously challenged for Speaker?
She does seem to have a potential math problem. There is reputedly a letter out there which 17 Democrats have already signed saying they will not vote for her. That would cause her to come up short to getting the 218 she would need. And I think the other thing that has become more problematic is the emergence of Marcia Fudge, an actual contender potentially. People now talking about whether or not she could run. And if she were to throw her hat in the ring, it's another woman. She's from Ohio. And this would solve the gender problem Democrats say they have if they were to get rid of Speaker Pelosi.
Well, Kim, that gender card, Pelosi's playing it, and her supporters are playing it really hard. They're saying, look, you can't afford, as a Democratic Party, to be seen opposing a woman as leader. But hey, if you want to rise to the top of something, you know, and then say, well, we have to break the glass ceiling, it means sometimes you have to fall through the glass floor once in a while, too, no?
It's a ridiculous argument. Look, this isn't about gender. It isn't about ageism, which her supporters have also been claiming. This is just about a Democratic Party that just won re-election to the majority in the House, and they want some change. They've had the same people in charge for a very long time. That's a natural thing to want to do. The only thing that stopped it from happening up until now is no one has stepped forward. That might be about to change.
Which Democratic Party is going to be in charge of the House? The progressives, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or the many moderates who won for the first time out there across the country by running as moderates?
Now, answer your own question. I think you know.
Well, yeah, it'll be the progressives. But, you know, Nancy Pelosi, the question is, who can control this team of wild horses coming into the Democratic House? No question about it. The Democrats really do need new leadership. All of the leadership there are in their 70s. It's time for a generational change. But the question is, which generation of leaders? And if you're going to have a House that is investigating Donald Trump, is going ahead with all of these subpoenas, it's going to be a wild and woolly place. And I would argue that probably Nancy Pelosi at this point is the only individual who has the skills to control what's going to happen among the Democrats over the next year.
And I suspect, Dan, that because they'll recognize that she'll keep it. Also, she's tougher than most of them, frankly.
That's for sure.
She's more ruthless. There's no question about that. Kate, let's turn to Donald Trump and the turmoil inside the White House. Lots of reports of change. Of course, we had Melania Trump basically firing the deputy national security advisor. How much more change are we going to see?
Well, Paul, I think it's relatively normal to see some staff shakeup after a couple years and after midterms. We've heard a lot of reports about Jim Mattis maybe leaving the Pentagon or Ryan Zinke stepping down at Interior. But I think this might be an interesting moment, Paul, because think about who would want to take those positions right now. For one, it's easier to be confirmed if the Republicans have expanded their Senate majority, but you also have Democrats in the House who are going to be issuing subpoenas, and who wants to have, kind of their every minutia subjected to a Democratic House when the goal is very obviously to take out as many Trump cabinet officials as possible. And then add to that, like you said, you have the possibility of being fired on Twitter by the First Lady. It just is not a great working environment. So potentially you could see some real talent problems at the White House.
Yeah, I think it's a terrible look, Dan, to have Mira Ricardo, whatever her transgressions were in terms of individual decorum, to be run out of town like that and so publicly. And John Bolton, he needs a loyal team, and he's had a hard time assembling it.
That's exactly the point. I mean, Mira Ricardo, let's keep in mind, was the deputy national security advisor. And firing her like that, saying she would no longer have the honor of serving in the White, reinforces the idea that Trump is sort of like the House of Tudor. It would be one thing to take her to the woodshed.
Is that unfair to the Tudors?
A little bit. She was a trusted advisor to John Bolton, the national security advisor. They have on their plate North Korea, China, the Middle East, Russia. To simply pull her out is going to leave a big hole in John Bolton's operation. That doesn't make a lot of sense, Paul.
Kim, is John Kelly going to go as chief of staff? And are we really in danger here of returning to the kind of first 6 months of chaos in the Trump White House?
Well, let's just be careful. We've had many supposed announcements of Kelly's leaving, and that hasn't happened yet. So we'll wait and see what actually comes of this latest round of rumors. But look, I think in the end, the question for the president is, what kind of administration does he want to run? A lot of this upheaval seems to be related to the fact that he's got very strong cabinet members, very talented cabinet members, who sometimes push back on him on the limits of policy or the law. And he seems to resent that, and it caused a lot of unhappiness between him and some of his top leaders. But, you know, this is also something presidents should want, is people that are giving him good guidance and pushback. That's what Kelly has done. And I think we should all hope he does stay, because that's a tough job, chief of staff, especially in this White House. And it does risk going back to a level of chaos we saw before.
Kate, just to finish up here in this block, you got Jeff Flake saying he won't vote for judicial nominees, and Chuck Schumer agrees with him, and he's going to try to force a vote on this bill to enforce, to protect so-called Mueller. But that strikes me as blatantly unconstitutional. You can't Congress cannot tell a president that he's unable to fire somebody who works for him in the executive branch. Is that going anywhere?
You know, Paul, I don't think it's going anywhere. And if Jeff Flake wants to make that his legacy, I guess that's his choice. But with a 53 Senate majority next Congress, they're going to confirm those judges anyway. So I think it's just a kind of a bad choice by Flake, but I don't think it will ultimately pass because, like you said, it's obviously constitutionally infirm.
All right. Thank you all. Still ahead, as Nancy Pelosi's leadership fight heats up, House Republicans prepare.
Suppressed map. We were able to sweep up to almost 40 seats so far.
Nancy Pelosi this week taking a victory lap as Democrats appear to be on track to pick up between 35 and maybe 40 seats in the House, and calling on her party to find common ground going forward as she faces internal opposition to her bid for Speaker. This as newly elected Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy acknowledges shortcomings in the midterms.
We took a beating inside the suburban areas. We're going to have to work harder. I think our message is going to have to be clearer. Our ideas are going to have to be stronger. We realize that, and we will work towards that effort.
Wall Street Journal columnist and Fox News contributor Karl Rove served as senior advisor to President George W. Bush. First, Karl, welcome. But let me ask you about these Florida recounts. Are they going to make any difference, do you think, now the hand recount is going on in the Senate?
No, I don't think so. We've never had a recount, even in Florida, where 13,000 votes separating the two candidates, that something magically has appeared to erase that kind of a gap. So, no, it's going to further tarnish Florida's reputation. It's going to give the Democrats a talking point for 2020. I think this is more about 2020 than it is about 2018 at this moment.
All right. Thanks on that. Let's talk about the elections, because as you know, 10 days later, you look at what happened. It looks to me like a bigger defeat for the Republican Party than some people initially acknowledge. And I say that because it's the biggest loss in the House of seats since 1974. And in the Senate races, though they did pick those Senate seats up in some of the right-leaning states, in the swing states, boy, they got beat in every race except for Florida, and that was close. What do you think? Is that fair?
Well, I think it is. It is bigger than we thought on election night, and it's a suburban wipeout. In New Jersey, the New York and Philadelphia suburbs, wipeout. Virginia, D.C., Richmond, Tidewater, Charleston, South Carolina suburbs, Atlanta suburbs, Miami suburbs, Detroit, Chicago, Oklahoma City, Houston, Dallas.
That's
Denver,
a lot of
Salt
cities,
Lake City,
Carl.
Denver, Salt Lake
That's
City,
a lot of
Orange
cities.
County and L.A. County. I mean, it's just you go to the suburbs of those places, every one of those Republicans lost seats, some of which they'd held for decades. And so, yeah, in fact, My sense is it depends on what base you use. There were 193 Democrats and 235 Republicans on Election Day in the House. There were 10 vacant seats. The Democrats are now approaching 234. So, you know, that's a big chunk of gains, and most of them, virtually all of them, are in the suburbs.
Well, what is the lesson you take away from that? Because one lesson that a lot of the people I'm talking to are taking away is this is a shrinking Republican coalition. Trump is realigning the GOP, but he's realigning it as a minority party. There'll be a lot of viewers who don't like to hear that, but if you look at the election results, honestly, that seems to be happening.
Well, I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, but yes, that's the fundamental truth. I think we've got people who voted Republican, maybe for a governor or maybe for their local offices, but when it came to races, particularly for the House, they wanted to send a message to the Trump White House that they were dissatisfied. We saw this in the polling in Senate races. You had roughly, no matter what the number of people were that approved of the president, and it ranged from, you know, basically the high 40s in some states to the 60s in some of these red states that there were Senate elections this year. Just less than 1/3 of the voters said, I don't approve of him personally, but I approve of his policies, while 2/3 of the people who approved of him said, I approve of both. But you had, interestingly enough, about 10% of the electorate that said, I approve of his policies, but I don't approve of him personally, and I'm going to give him an unfavorable rating overall. And those were people primarily in the suburbs, particularly college-educated and particularly college-educated women.
Okay, as you go ahead to look ahead to 2020, then how does the GOP and particularly President Trump get them back? Because he's got to reassemble that coalition that won in 2016 in states where he got really thumped: Pennsylvania, Ohio. Well, Ohio they did all right, but Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and he came close in 2016 in Minnesota, but this year was a wipeout.
Yeah, well, in Georgia is a defense, and North Carolina is going to be defense. Florida is going to be defense. They came relatively close in Colorado, but that's going to be a problem. So, look, we have two problems with suburban voters. Our old problem used to be that they were relatively socially moderate but economically conservative. They remain that way today, but in addition to navigating those shoals, you have to deal with the fact that they don't like the president's tone. They don't like how he handles things. They don't like how he tweets. They want a different tone in a president that is more optimistic and unifying than they're seeing right now.
Okay, so if that's a fixable problem if Trump is willing to do it. All right, let's talk about Nancy Pelosi a bit before we go. I mean, you did an interesting column this week, kind of adding up the number of Democrats who are now in Congress who said, I'm not going to vote for, I don't want to vote for, or different gradations of that. Do you think she's going to win anyway?
I think she will, but let's be clear about it. There are 234 Democrats. There are 26 Democrats who, during the campaign, said explicitly, I will not support her.
Right.
11 of those were incumbents. The rest are freshmen. And that means that if all of them held true to their word, she'd get 208 votes, 10 short of what she needs in order to be Speaker. She'd still have the majority. There are only going to be 201 Republicans, so she'd still have the majority. But if they voted for somebody else, she'd come up short of the 218. Now, theoretically, they could all vote present rather than voting for somebody, and that would lower the number of votes that you would need. In that case, it would lower it down to about 205, I think, or 206. But she's got to get 218, and the only way she can get there now is one of two ways. Either people break their word that they gave to the voters with the very first vote they cast in Congress, or they vote present, and it's going to be sort of hard to explain that one, too.
Well, voting present, I mean, is a cop-out. Let's face it. I mean, it's, I said I vote against her, and then I said, oh, well, I chickened out in the end. That can show up in an ad in 2020 as well as voting for her.
Absolutely. And look, we're likely to see that happen. We've already seen it happen in the Senate. Senator Kristen Sinema of Arizona said in the campaign, under no circumstances will I support Chuck Schumer for Senate Democratic leader. And yesterday he was elected Senate Democratic leader unanimously.
All right, Carl. Well, politicians not keeping their word. What a surprise. Thank you. When we come back with polls showing that health care was the pivotal issue.
Democrats are going to continue to press our Republican colleagues for better, more comprehensive health care.
Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer Wednesday promising to make health care a central part of the Democratic agenda in the next 2 years as the party looks toward 2020. Polls show that health care was the top issue for voters in the midterm elections, with Democrats stoking fears that Republicans would end coverage of pre-existing conditions. We're back with Dan Henninger, Kim Strassel, and Kate Batchelder Odell. So, Kate, do you think, you look at all the exit polling, you look at the races, did the failure of Republicans to repeal and replace Obamacare cost them the House?
Yes, I think that's absolutely the conclusion you have to take, because I think what happened, Paul, was there was a bit of a double bind in that the base was unhappy that the party failed to repeal the law, and more moderate and independent voters were unhappy that the party tried to repeal the law. So they took all of the political heat of having succeeded without having any of the accomplishments or policy outcomes they could point to. They were in a double bind. I don't think it's like what the left says, which is that the law is just increasingly durable and popular.
So if they had actually done something and passed a repeal and replace, then they could have pointed to that and said, see, we've done something to address this issue, and here's how we would handle pre-existing conditions. When they failed, what happened is that the Democrats could say, see, they wanted to do this, and you're just trying to prove a counterfactual.
Right, exactly. It would have disproven the theory that people were going to be thrown off their insurance for having a pre-existing condition. I think also, Paul, we saw Republicans supporting a lawsuit on the constitutionality of some of Obamacare's mandates, including the pre-existing condition mandate. And while these are sort of interesting legal questions, it's not likely to prevail. And the people supporting it, the candidates supporting it, took a huge political hit for having supported it. And it doesn't seem to have been worthwhile. It looks like a political loser.
And that was Ken Paxton, the Attorney General of Texas, who led that. And we criticized him for that, I recall. You probably wrote the editorial, Kate, but and then he came back and said, oh, no, this is good. But it really did hurt them.
It did. And look, it's just unfortunately, it's not going to convince John Roberts to strike down the Affordable Care Act. He already went through so much struggle to find a way to uphold it, and I don't see this changing the outcome. And what Republicans really should be doing is spending this time in the wilderness thinking about how they're going to sell their ideas better if they get another shot at repealing the law.
Kim, Jason Lewis, who was running in Minneapolis suburbs, a Republican incumbent, he lost his race, wrote for us this week that John McCain killing repeal and replace was the real, in the Senate, was the real decisive vote. And, of course, that got a lot of criticism. How can you criticize John McCain? But what do you think of that?
No, there's something to that. Look, it's just the way it was. John McCain was very proud of that vote, and we should remember that he took it. He and Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, the Republicans, were on a knife's edge, close enough to get this through. It would have given them, as Kate said, both the actual success of repealing it, but the ability to then go out and see some changes in the law that helped bring down prices and where people could see what was actually happening. They didn't do it in the end. It was a huge failure on that part, given the campaign promise. And yeah, I mean, look, the House Republicans bore the brunt of the decision made by a handful of senators on the other chamber.
So, Dan, where do the Democrats, when Chuck Schumer says or threatens, depending on your point of view, we're going to make health care our focus, what are they going to do?
Threaten. Yeah, let's go with threaten.
Well, Obamacare, they passed that, and now basically it hurt them for several elections, and now they're now champions of it.
The Democrats for the next year are going to be aiming at two targets. One, Donald Trump. The other, the pharmaceutical industry, big pharma. Elijah Cummings, who's becoming chairman of the House Oversight Committee, which is a tremendously powerful committee, is probably going to spend about 70% of his time tormenting the Trump administration, but he says he intends to investigate the pharmaceutical industry. And he's going to issue subpoenas, he's going to ask questions about drug prices, and the goal is going to be to kind of use that as a cat's paw to get them to compromise on some sort of deal that regulates drug prices in the United States. And the problem is that the President of the United States himself seems to be willing to do that. He has talked about associating Medicare Part B prescription prices to those in developed countries over in Europe. So Big Pharma has really got its work cut out for him defending its innovation.
Yeah, I think, Kate, that's a possibility for Trump. He might go for that. And then also, what about Medicare for all? Is that something that Democrats are going to push, or are they going to, in the House and Senate, or are they going to leave that to the presidential candidates?
You know, Paul, I think they're going to be relatively quiet about that over the next couple years, because I think it's really unpopular with the public when you start to talk about, eliminating employer-sponsored insurance, right? I mean, the Bernie Medicare for All bill was not written to become law. It was written as sort of a eccentric policy proposal. And so I don't think it's helpful to Democratic House candidates to hold it up as what they're really about. I think that Dan's right. They're really going to coalesce more on the pharmaceutical price controls idea, because it's something that they think Trump can be amenable to, and maybe talk about things like a public option.
Opened 2 new headquarters in the D.C. suburbs of Arlington, Virginia, and the borough of Queens in New York City. But outrage is growing as details of the deal emerge, with New York State alone offering more than $1.5 billion in tax breaks and incentives to the retail giant in return for bringing a promised 25,000 jobs to its new campus. Mayor Bill de Blasio called it a great day for New York City, but even newly elected Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a Democratic socialist, called the taxpayer subsidies extremely concerning. We're back with Dan Henninger, Wall Street Journal columnist Bill McGurn, and editorial board member Alicia Finley. So, Bill, my favorite part of this is the helipad that they get at the new campus.
Right.
I guess that will not be available to everyone.
Right.
But is this a good deal for New York and Virginia?
No, it's not. It shows that the real threat to the economic order isn't socialism, it's corporatism. Like, call us old-fashioned, but if you're going to have welfare, it should be for the poor, not for the world's richest man. And that seems to be uniting people. I mean, Governor Cuomo's defense of this deal was extraordinary. In the New York Times, he basically said, since our tax rates are such a disincentive, anyone in his right mind, just judging by the merits, would go to Texas. Therefore, I had to cough up a lot of stuff to get Amazon to come here, to give them privileges and favors that other people don't get.
But who's responsible for those tax rates?
Right. Exactly.
Right? I mean,
right.
He could change those.
Right.
But that's hard.
Look, that's the difference. They're all betting you jack your rates. You have a business unfriendly environment in the state, right? And then you play favorites and you try to get someone to bail you out like this. Look, it's not the first time. Governor Cuomo had that Buffalo billion, ended in corruption. None of the jobs produced that it promised.
That was a subsidy program for business in upstate
New York, and ended in corruption and failure.
I don't think it's ended, it's continued.
Right.
Well, so Alicia, from Amazon's point of view, though, even though all that's true about Jeff Bezos, it's hard to blame him, I guess, it seems to me, if the politicians are willing to shower him with money. I mean, he's a pragmatic businessman, and if they're saying, here, you can have all this, then why not take it?
Right. I mean, Elon Musk did the same thing with Nevada and a battery factory. If they're going to give him a couple $1 billion, why not?
And Scott Walker with Foxconn in Wisconsin.
And now he's suggesting another package for Kimberly Clark to help rescue jobs there. This is bipartisan on both sides. But really, the politicians should be responsible and be more responsible stewards of taxpayer dollars.
But 260-some jurisdictions tried to get Amazon. So this is...
And Amazon actually turned down something like Maryland and Newark, which offered even bigger subsidies, which suggests maybe it would have gone to New York and D.C. anyways.
Because why? Because
it has more intellectual capital. It has talent, right? Tech talent, finance, banks, and hedge funds are really recruiting engineers. Amazon will be able to poach some of those.
The figure, Dan, that I like, another one is that Google has a big presence in New York as well. I think they have something like 10,000 jobs here. They're not getting a package of $1.5 billion. And I think Alicia's point is a salient one. They might have gone here anyway, New York anyway, because of the other things it offers.
Yeah, they might have. I mean, one of the things Amazon says is they need a heavy core, a critical mass of technological workers, and they feel New York, Northern Virginia is going to be able to provide that. City of Columbus said, we admit we don't have enough technical workers to supply Amazon with 25,000 people. All that aside, to me, the most fascinating thing going on here is that this deal was done by Mayor Bill de Blasio and Governor Andrew Cuomo, both probable candidates for the Democratic nomination. They are getting hammered hammered by fellow Democrats who are just dumping on them for giving away this $2 billion. I think what's going on here is that Ocasio-Cortez, the head of the city council, are upset that this money has gone to Amazon and not to their pet project. It's not as though they're upset about corporate welfare. It's just that the money's all gone now.
It's the wrong corporate welfare.
Right, exactly.
Look, that's what happens when you politicize decisions. One of the really bad aspects of this was that a lot of the cities didn't say what they were offering. You know, they're going to spend the taxpayers' money, but it was secret. Some disclosed, some didn't. But I think Amazon insisted on a non-disclosure clause for the last 20, the finalists. So this really was the case. We had to agree to it to find out what was in it. And I think that's why people are also just sprung on them this way.
Is there any chance that this could be undone?